Richard Hale slid the divorce papers across the glass table with one hand, and with the other he was already texting Lydia Crow. He didn't even look up. 22 years. 2 decades of Hannah's life, her loyalty, her silence, and he couldn't spare her a single glance on the day he erased her. If you've ever watched someone you loved treat you like you were already gone, stay with me. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if no one has told you yet today, subscribe, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about silence. The conference room on the 43rd floor of Hargrove and Sloane overlooked all of Manhattan, like a god looking down at something it no longer cared about. Hannah Whitmore. She had never taken his name. A decision Richard had mocked for years, sat perfectly still in a leather chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her hands were folded on the table. Her face was composed. Her breathing was slow and even, the kind of breathing you only learn after years of practice, after years of learning how to survive in a room where no one was rooting for you. Across from her sat Richard Hale, 51 years old, silver-templed, tailored in navy blue like a man who had already moved on before the paperwork was finished. He had the posture of someone who had rehearsed this moment, the slight lean back in his chair, the casual pen twirling, the way his eyes swept past her to the city below, as if she were already part of his past, and he was already thinking about lunch. Between them, 3 lawyers. 2 were Richard's. One was supposed to be Hannah's, but she had noticed 20 minutes earlier the way that man kept checking his phone under the table and not quite meeting her eyes. She had said nothing about it. The papers were laid out in clean, precise stacks. 47 pages of the systematic dismantling of a life. 22 years reduced to clauses and subclauses and the cold language of asset division. Richard's lead attorney, a man named Calloway with thin lips and a practiced sympathy smile, cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore Hale. Whitmore, Hannah said quietly. Just Whitmore. Calloway nodded, barely missing a beat. Ms. Whitmore, we've outlined the agreed-upon terms. As discussed, the Riverside apartment will revert to Mr. Hale's sole ownership, as it was purchased prior to the marriage under his existing trust. The joint accounts have been transferred to a holding arrangement pending final settlement review. Your signature on page 112 and 43 will complete today's proceedings. Hannah looked at the papers. She did not reach for the pen. Calloway's smile tightened by a fraction. Is there something you'd like to review? I've reviewed it, she said. Then, I'm just looking at it. She paused. I'm allowed to look at it. Richard's jaw shifted. That small muscle near his temple moved, the one that always moved when he was irritated and trying not to show it. She had spent 22 years learning the map of his face. She knew every road on it. Hannah. His voice was controlled smooth, the voice he used in boardrooms. We've been through this. There's nothing to gain by drawing it out. I'm not drawing anything out, she said, still looking at the papers. I'm being thorough. Your attorney has already reviewed. My attorney, Hannah said, and now she did look up, and her eyes landed on the man beside her, who had spent the last 20 minutes studying the table, has been very quiet today. The lawyer, his name was Brennan Paul. Brennan, recommended by a mutual friend, she now understood to be Richard's mutual friend, finally looked at her. There was something in his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the discomfort of a man who had been paid to stand in a room and do very little. The terms are fair, Ms. Whitmore, Brennan said. Given the circumstances. Given what circumstances? Silence. Calloway jumped in smoothly. The terms reflect the legal structure of your shared assets, which, as you know, were predominantly held under Mr. Hale's pre-existing. I know what they reflect, Hannah said. Her voice did not rise. It did not crack. It stayed exactly where it had been, low and level and clear as water. I'm asking Mr. Brennan what circumstances he's referring to. Brennan shifted in his seat. The marriage, Miss Whitmore. The length of it. The nature of... I'd like to know, Hannah said, who recommended you to me. The room went very still. Richard leaned forward for the first time. Hannah. Was it Marcus Teller? She asked, looking at Brennan, still not at Richard. Or was it Jennifer Kwan? Or did Richard just call someone he knew and say, she needs a lawyer, send me a good one I can trust? Brennan's silence was its own answer. Richard's voice dropped to something quiet and sharp. You're embarrassing yourself. Hannah turned to look at her husband, her soon-to-be ex-husband, for the first time that morning. Really looked at him. She studied his face the way you study something you are committing to memory because you know you will never need it again. "No," she said simply. "I'm not." She picked up the pen. She signed on page 1, page 12, page 43. Each signature slow and deliberate, her name written with the kind of clarity that said she understood exactly what she was doing. Then she set the pen down, pushed her chair back, and stood. She did not shake anyone's hand. She did not say goodbye. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair, the camel coat she had owned for 7 years, the one she had refused to replace, even when Richard had called it embarrassing at a dinner party 2 winters ago, and she walked out of the conference room without a single backward glance. The elevator was empty. She pressed the lobby button and watched the doors close, and for exactly 4 seconds alone in that mirror-lined box, she let herself feel it. Not cry, just feel. The weight of it. The 22 years. The slow, methodical way a person can be loved and then unloved and then erased. 4 seconds. Then the doors opened and Hannah Whitmore walked out into Manhattan. She made it 11 steps before her phone buzzed. It was a notification from her bank. She stopped walking. The notification read, "Account access temporarily restricted. Please contact your branch for assistance." She stood in the middle of the lobby of a 43-story building full of people who were all moving somewhere, all carrying briefcases and coffees, and the general forward momentum of people who knew where they were going, and she opened the banking app. Account balance, $0. She blinked. Opened the savings account. $0. She opened the credit card app. Card suspended pending review. Her fingers were very steady. She was almost proud of them for that. She walked to the revolving doors and pushed through them and stepped out onto the street where November had decided to arrive early and mean it, and she stood on the sidewalk in the camel coat that Richard had called embarrassing, and she thought very clearly and without panic he planned this. Not just the divorce, not just the lawyers, all of it. The timing, the account transfers happening simultaneously with the signing. The apartment already locked, she would discover 30 minutes later when the key fob beeped red at her, and the doorman looked at her with something between pity and professional detachment and said, "I'm sorry, Ms. Whitmore, I've been instructed." She hadn't let him finish. She had nodded, turned, and walked back to the street. She sat on a bench in Bryant Park for 2 hours. Not because she was lost, because she was thinking. The pigeons moved around her feet with the absolute indifference of creatures who had seen everything this city had to offer and been impressed by none of it. A child nearby threw bread crusts and laughed. The wind came through the park in cold, indifferent gusts. Hannah thought about the morning she had met Richard. She had been 29, a mid-level analyst at a financial consulting firm, sharp and overlooked in the way that young women in finance were sharp and overlooked in those years. He had walked into a presentation she was giving, walked in late, sat in the back, and at the end had come up to her and said, "You buried the most important number on slide 11. You should have led with it." Why, and she had been so startled by someone actually paying attention that she had said, "You're right." And he had smiled like a man who was not used to people agreeing with him and found it unexpectedly charming. She had been so young. She thought about the years that came after, the slow erosion of the things that had made her sharp, the way his world had expanded while hers had quietly contracted, the career she had paused for his schedule, the projects she had set aside, the ideas she had kept in notebooks because there was never quite the right time. The right time, it turned out, had never been coming. It was a woman named Deirdre Chen who broke through the silence. Deirdre was 61, recently retired from 30 years in corporate law, and she sat down next to Hannah on that bench, not because she knew her, but because she was tired, and it was the only available seat. She had a large coffee and a small dog on a leash that immediately put its head in Hannah's lap. "Sorry," Deirdre said. "He does that to sad-looking people." Hannah looked down at the dog. "Do I look sad?" "You look like someone who just got very bad news very calmly, which is almost worse." Deirdre sipped her coffee. "You want to talk about it, or should I just sit here and pretend I'm not noticing?" Hannah considered the question seriously. "I think I just need to understand something." "What's that?" How long someone has to plan something like this? She paused. The frozen accounts, the apartment, the lawyer, my lawyer, who I'm fairly certain was never actually mine. How long does that kind of orchestration take? Deirdre was quiet for a moment. You're talking about a legal setup. I'm talking about someone making sure I walked out of a building today with nothing. Deirdre set her coffee cup on her knee. Months, she said. At minimum. Probably longer. She looked at Hannah directly. Do you have somewhere to go tonight? Hannah opened her mouth and then closed it, because the honest answer was no. It was the first time she had said it, even just to herself, even just in the privacy of her own mind. No. She had no account access, no apartment. The small amount of cash she kept in her coat pocket, a habit from years ago that she had never broken $37, was everything she had in the physical world. Deirdre reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. My firm closed last year, but I kept the cards out of vanity. She held it out. The address on the back. It's my building. My spare room isn't beautiful, but it's warm and the coffee is good. You can stay until you figure out your next move. Hannah looked at the card. She looked at Deirdre. You don't know me. I know enough, Deirdre said. I know what planned erasure looks like. I've seen it in courtrooms for 30 years. She paused. And I know you didn't cry on this bench. That means you're already thinking. So think somewhere warm. Hannah took the card. She slept in Deirdre's spare room that night. The room smelled like old books and cedar. The dog, whose name turned out to be Harold, slept at the foot of the bed with the solemn commitment of a dog who took guest comfort very seriously. Hannah lay in the dark with her eyes open and thought about what Richard had expected her to do today. He had expected collapse. She understood that now. The frozen accounts, the locked apartment, the compromised lawyer, it was all designed to hit simultaneously, to overwhelm, to break the dam before she had time to build any walls. He had expected her to call someone, cry to someone, make a scene, become a version of herself that he could point to later and say, you see, this is why. She had not done any of those things, and something about that, the fact that she had not given him what he expected, sat in her chest like a small, quiet ember. She was not finished. She was not broken. She was something else, something she didn't have a full word for yet, but she was thinking. And somewhere in the machinery of her mind, gears that had been still for years were beginning slowly and with great deliberateness to turn. 3 days passed. They were not easy days. Easy is a luxury for people who have options, and Hannah's options in those first 72 hours were narrow enough to make her breathless if she looked at them directly. She had $37. She had the clothes on her back and the items in her bag. Her phone, whose bill was on autopay from an account that hadn't been frozen because Richard hadn't known about it. A small personal account she had maintained since before the marriage, with a balance modest enough that he had never paid it attention. $1,412, enough to breathe with, not enough to build with. She went to a job placement agency on the second day. The woman across the desk was professional and genuinely trying, but the conversation had a particular quality to it that Hannah recognized the quality of someone managing expectations downward. You've been out of the workforce for, the woman checked the screen, 11 years. I've done consulting work, project-based, mostly informal. For whom? For my husband's firm. She paused. My ex-husband's firm, Hale Capital. The woman's expression shifted by the smallest fraction. Do you have documentation of that work? Not formally. References. Hannah thought about every person at Hale Capital who had nodded along with her analysis in meetings and then credited Richard in the debrief. Not ones I'd want to use at the moment. The woman typed something. We have some administrative positions that might be a good re-entry point. I ran financial strategy for a $40 million portfolio, Hannah said, not with anger, just with clarity. I'm not asking for re-entry. I'm asking for a level that matches my actual experience. The woman looked at her with something that was not unkindness, but was very much the face of practical reality. Ms. Whitmore, without recent formal employment history and without verifiable references in the current market. Thank you for your time, Hannah said. She walked out into the cold. On the third evening, sitting at Deirdre's kitchen table with Harold asleep on her feet and a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop, Hannah received an email. The subject line was Strategic Opportunity, Monroe Logistics Group. She almost deleted it. Because it had the structure of a recruitment pitch, and she had received enough recruitment pitches in her life to know that most of them were noise. But something made her pause. The language was not the language of a recruiter. It was precise, specific. It referenced in the second paragraph a paper she had written not published, never published. A paper she had drafted 3 years ago and shared with exactly 2 people because it outlined a structural vulnerability in mid-market logistics investment that she had identified through work she'd done quietly for Richard that he had absorbed into his own strategy without attribution. She read the email 3 times. At the bottom, a brief call if you're willing. Thursday, 11 a.m., you can verify this address. There was an address, Monroe Logistics Group. She looked it up. It was real. It was substantial. It was, she discovered after 20 minutes of research, one of the most quietly powerful logistics investment firms operating in the Northeast. She sat back in Deirdre's kitchen chair. Someone had read work she had never published. Someone had found a paper that existed on exactly 2 hard drives and in 2 people's inboxes. Someone had looked at that work and seen it clearly enough to track her down 11 years after she'd written it, 3 days after she'd been deliberately erased from her own life. Hannah picked up her coffee, drank it cold, set it down. Harold lifted his head, looked at her with the deep seriousness of a dog who understood important moments, then set his head back down on her feet. "I know," she said quietly to the room. "I know." She was not going to call Richard. She was not going to contact any of the people in their social circle who were, she understood clearly, now Richard's social circle. She was not going to explain herself or defend herself or ask anyone for anything. She was going to be very, very still. And she was going to pay very, very close attention. Because someone was watching this situation. Someone had been watching it possibly for longer than she understood. And they hadn't watched it to see her fail. They had watched it to see what she would do when the world expected her to fall apart. And she hadn't. She wrote back to the email. 6 words. Thursday at 11. I'll be there. She pressed send and looked at the window over Deirdre's sink, where the city lights made the night glow, like it always did, indifferent and constant, and completely uninterested in the smallness or largeness of any individual life. Richard, she knew, was across that city somewhere right now. Probably at dinner, probably with Lydia Crow, who was 38 and effortlessly confident, and who had been in their orbit long enough that Hannah understood in the clearest hindsight of her life that the divorce had not ended an affair. It had simply formalized one that had already been running for long enough to leave tracks if you knew where to look. Richard was probably telling Lydia that it was done, that Hannah had been handled, that the situation was clean. Hannah thought about that word. Handled. She thought about how thoroughly he had designed this. Not just the legal instruments, the pre-positioned accounts, the attorney arrangement, the apartment trust structure, but the psychological architecture of it, the way he had taken everything simultaneously so she would have no footing, no ground to stand on, no breath to gather. She thought about how much he must have assumed her to be. Fragile, dependent, without resources of her own, without a mind that had been quietly watching and filing and understanding, even when she hadn't been given credit for understanding anything. She picked up her pen. She still used a pen, a small silver one she had carried for 15 years, and she opened the notebook on the table beside her laptop. At the top of the page, she wrote one word: why? Not as a question of emotion, not, why did he stop loving me? Or why wasn't I enough? She was done with those questions. She had said goodbye to them on that bench in Bryant Park, between the pigeons and the cold. Why as a question of architecture? Why this structure? Why this timing? Why the specific mechanisms he had chosen? What was he protecting? What was he building, and what had he needed her out of the way for? Because Hannah Whitmore had spent 22 years sitting in rooms and being underestimated, and the particular education of the underestimated is this: you learn everything. You learn it because no one is being careful around you. No one is guarding their words or their body language or their decisions because they've already decided you don't matter enough to be a threat. You become invisible, and in your invisibility you see everything. She had seen everything. She began to write. Not names, not accusations, just the shape of things. Patterns she had noticed and filed away. Decisions that hadn't made sense at the time, numbers that had moved in ways she'd questioned privately and been dismissed from questioning publicly. She wrote for 2 hours. Harold snored gently at her feet. The coffee went completely cold and was forgotten. When she finally stopped, the notebook had 14 pages of notes in her small, precise handwriting. She looked at what she had written, and for the first time in 3 days, maybe for the first time in much longer than that, something that was not quite a smile, but was the precursor to one moved across her face. She had been removed from the board, but she had never stopped watching the game, and on Thursday morning, she was going to walk into a room where someone had been watching it with her. She closed the notebook. She looked at the city in the window. "All right," she said quietly and completely to herself. "Let's see what this is." Thursday came the way important days always do, without announcement, without ceremony, just another cold morning that happened to contain something that could change everything. Hannah woke at 5:15. Not because of an alarm, because her mind had never fully stopped running since she'd closed that notebook 3 nights ago, and by 5:15 it had simply decided that sleep had given it everything it was going to get. She dressed carefully. She had limited options in the clothing department. What she had carried in her bag the day of the signing, plus 2 things Deirdre had quietly left folded on the bathroom counter, without comment. A gray cashmere sweater and dark wool slacks that fit Hannah almost perfectly, because as Deirdre had said simply, "We're built the same. Take them." Hannah had not argued. She was learning quickly that pride was a luxury, with a price she couldn't currently afford, and that accepting help with grace was its own kind of strength. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. 51 years old. No makeup beyond what she had in her bag. Hair pulled back cleanly. The gray sweater, the dark slacks, the camel coat over everything. She did not look defeated. She had checked for that specifically. She looked like a woman on her way somewhere important. Good, she thought. That's exactly what she was. Deirdre was already in the kitchen when Hannah came out coffee, made Harold sitting beside the table with the hopeful posture of a dog who had not yet been fed breakfast, and felt this was a matter of some urgency. "You slept," Deirdre said. It was not quite a question. "Some. Eat something." "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said eat something." Deirdre set a plate in front of her. Toast, an egg, simple. You're walking into a room with someone who already knows something about you that you don't fully understand yet. You need to be sharp. Sharp requires fuel. Hannah sat down and ate. Harold watched each bite with the tragic focus of a witness to injustice. "Do you know Monroe Logistics?" Hannah asked between bites. "I know of it." Deirdre refilled her own coffee. Caleb Monroe built it from a regional operation into something considerably larger over about 15 years. He's not loud about it. That's notable in this city, where everyone with money tends to announce it. She paused. He's also had a reputation for selective investments, not just companies, people. People. He has a history of identifying talent that other institutions have overlooked or mishandled, bringing it inside and building around it. Deirdre looked at her steadily. "You're not the first person to get that email, Hannah. But I'd wager you're the first to receive it under these particular circumstances." Hannah finished the egg, set the fork down. "You think he knew about the divorce?" "I think very little happens in this city's financial world without Caleb Monroe knowing about it if he decides it's worth knowing about." She picked up Harold's food bowl and began filling it. "The question isn't whether he knows. The question is what he intends to do about what he knows. And only one way to find that out." Hannah stood, picked up her coat. "Thank you, Deirdre." "Don't thank me yet." Deirdre didn't turn around. "Come back and tell me how it went. That's thanks enough." The Monroe Logistics Group offices occupied 4 floors of a building in Midtown that announced nothing. No logo on the exterior, no ostentatious lobby display. The kind of building that made you understand by its very restraint that the people inside had nothing to prove to people on the outside. Hannah gave her name at reception. She was taken immediately, no waiting room, no delay to the 28th floor, and then down a hallway to an office at the end, and the assistant who walked her there knocked once and opened the door and stepped aside. She walked in. Caleb Monroe stood up from behind his desk. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older, more obviously powerful, the kind of man who wore authority like a heavy coat. Instead, she found a man of perhaps 58, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from passivity, but from an extremely concentrated internal life. His hair was almost entirely gray. His eyes were dark and direct, and the kind of attentive that made you feel immediately uncomfortably that you were being read rather than seen. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "thank you for coming." "Mr. Monroe?" She shook his hand. Firm brief, no performance in it. She liked that. "Sit, please." She sat. He sat. He did not offer pleasantries. She appreciated that too. "I'm going to skip the part where I explain who I am," he said. "You researched the company. I'd assume you researched me as well." "To the extent that public information allows," she said. "You're harder to research than most." Something shifted slightly in his face. Approval, maybe? "The paper you wrote in 2021, he said. "The structural vulnerability analysis in mid-market logistics investment. How did you come to that conclusion?" Hannah blinked once. "You want to talk about methodology?" "I want to understand how you think. The conclusion was correct. I can verify that from positions we held at the time. But the path to it is what interests me." He leaned forward slightly. Most analysts looking at that sector at that time were focused on supply chain disruption as the primary risk factor. You identified capitalization sequencing as the deeper vulnerability. Why? Hannah looked at him. She thought about the nights she had spent building that analysis, the way Richard had glanced at it and said, "interesting," and then 6 months later incorporated 3 of its core arguments into a presentation he had given to his board with no mention of her name. "Because everyone was watching the disruption," she said. "No one was watching where the money was actually moving when the disruption happened. And when you watch the money, instead of the noise, you see that the companies most at risk weren't the ones with supply problems. They were the ones whose investment sequencing assumed stability that had already ended." Monroe was quiet for a moment. "Who did you share that paper with?" he asked. She met his eyes. "2 people, both of whom I trusted at the time. And you're aware that its core framework appeared in a Hale Capital board presentation in early 2022. It was not a question. It was something more precise than a question. It was a confirmation offered to her directly, without softening with the respect of being told a difficult thing plainly. "I'm aware," Hannah said, "and you said nothing. I had no formal documentation of authorship, no publication record, no timestamps that would have survived scrutiny." She paused. "And I was married to the man who presented it." Monroe looked at her for a long moment. "How long did you let that go on?" Hannah felt something tighten in her chest. Not pain exactly, more like the feeling of a wound being cleaned uncomfortable in the specific way that necessary things sometimes are. "Long enough to understand the full shape of it," she said. "And now you understand the full shape of it." "I'm beginning to." Monroe stood. He walked to the window, not to look out of it, she sensed, but because he was a person who thought better when he was moving. "I have a position," he said. "It's not a title I'm going to dress up in language designed to make it sound smaller than it is. It's a senior strategic analysis role. It would involve direct work on 3 active acquisition projects and oversight of a team of 7 analysts, none of whom, I'll tell you honestly, have had the kind of real-world exposure that your background represents." He turned to face her. "It would require you to be fully present starting within 2 weeks. It would require you to operate at a level that some people in comfortable positions take years to reach." He paused. "And it would pay you what that level of work is worth, which is considerably more than any re-entry role you've been offered this week." Hannah's expression didn't change, but something inside her went very, very still, in the way that things go still when they are important. "You know what I've been offered this week," she said. "I know what you've been doing this week," Monroe said, not unkindly. "I told you I pay attention to what I've decided is worth paying attention to." "Why?" she asked, directly, no softening. "Why me?" "Why, now you had the paper in 2022. You've had 2 years. Monroe came back to his desk. He sat. He laced his fingers together and looked at her the way a man looks at a question he's been waiting to be asked. Because in 2022, you were still inside a structure that would have complicated everything I'm building. Because the work I need done requires someone who is not encumbered by old loyalties or old arrangements. He paused. And because I needed to see what you would do when that structure was removed. The room was quiet. Hannah processed that. She let herself process it completely because it deserved that. Someone had been watching her. Not with predatory intent, she was reading him carefully, and she didn't feel that, but with the focused attention of a person who understood that circumstances reveal people in ways that ordinary conditions cannot. "You watched the divorce happen," she said. "I watched the situation develop," he said. "And I watched what you did in that conference room and outside it, and for the 3 days after. How—" "This city is smaller than it appears," he said simply. "I have eyes in a number of places. None of them were watching you specifically, until I decided they should be." He held her gaze. "What I saw was someone who, when handed the worst possible moment, did not break, did not perform, did not react." He paused. She started thinking. "And I need thinkers." Hannah was quiet. She looked at her hands on her lap and then back at him. "What happened to Hale Capital's position on the Vantage Meridian deal?" she asked. Monroe's eyes didn't flicker. "What makes you ask about Vantage Meridian?" "Because it's the only acquisition Richard was personally leading this quarter. Because it's been quiet for 6 weeks when it should be in its active due diligence phase. And because 3 of the structural vulnerabilities I identified in my 2021 paper apply directly to Vantage's capitalization structure." She paused. "I noticed he moved faster on the divorce than anything I would have expected. Rushed timelines tend to have reasons." A beat of silence. Then Monroe said quietly, "The Vantage deal is in significant trouble because of the capitalization sequencing, among other things." "And Richard doesn't know how to fix it," Hannah said, "because the person who understood the problem well enough to have solved it was the person he just removed from his life." Monroe looked at her with an expression that had moved past approval into something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has been waiting a long time to have a particular conversation and has finally found the right person to have it with. "The position is yours," he said, "if you want it." She should have asked for time. She should have asked for the formal offer in writing, the compensation structure, the title, breakdown, the team, reporting lines. All of those were reasonable, and she would need all of those. But first, she asked the only question that actually mattered. "Is this genuine?" Monroe looked at her steadily. "I don't do anything that isn't." Hannah nodded, once, the smallest, most deliberate nod of her life. "Then yes," she said, "I want it." She left Monroe Logistics at 12:40 in the afternoon and walked 6 blocks before she allowed herself to stop. She stood on a corner, cars streaming past the city, doing what the city always did, moving loudly without particular interest in the people caught in its current. She called Deirdre. "Well?" Deirdre answered on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," Hannah said, "and then I need to figure out an apartment situation within 2 weeks." Deirdre was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then, "Tell me first." Hannah told her. The paper, the position, the conversation, all of it clearly and without embellishment, standing on that corner, with the November wind making her eyes water in a way that had nothing to do with crying. When she finished, Deirdre said, "Hannah, he built his last 3 major acquisitions around strategic analysis teams. The person who ran those teams for the last 4 years just took a position in London." "I know," Hannah said. "I saw the announcement in September. He's been looking for a replacement for 4 months." "I know. And he found one in 3 days." "Apparently." There was a warmth in Deirdre's voice when she spoke again that was specific and personal, and the kind that comes from recognizing something real. "Come home. Harold has been miserable without you, and I've made soup." Hannah started walking again. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. She was 30 minutes into the walk when her phone rang, not a number she recognized. She almost let it go to voicemail. She answered. "Hannah." Richard's voice. Smooth and controlled, but with something underneath it she had never quite heard before. Attention. The kind that comes from a man who has just discovered something didn't go according to plan. "We need to talk." She kept walking. I heard you had a meeting this morning." She felt her pulse tick upward. Just once, just slightly. She breathed through it. "I had several things this morning, Richard. Coffee, breakfast. I've had a busy week." "Don't," his voice sharpened. "Don't do the thing where you make me feel like I'm overreacting. I know you went to Monroe's offices." The city was loud around her. She turned a corner and let the noise fill the pause before she answered. "That's interesting," she said. "How do you know that?" "That doesn't matter." "It matters quite a bit, actually." Her voice was perfectly calm, not cold, not angry, just clear. The kind of clarity that comes from the far side of fear. "It means you're watching me, Richard. Which means you're not nearly as done with this situation as you pretended to be when you slid those papers across a table and didn't look up." A pause. She could hear his breathing change. "Whatever Monroe told you," he said, "whatever he's offering, it's not what it appears to be. He has an agenda, Hannah. He always has an agenda." "Most people do," she said. "The question is whether it aligns with yours." She paused. "Goodbye, Richard." She hung up. She stood completely still on the sidewalk for one breath. 2, 3. He was watching her, which meant he was worried, which meant that whatever she had walked into that morning had dimensions she hadn't fully mapped yet, and Richard had caught a glimpse of them before she had. She started walking again, faster now, the November air sharp in her lungs, the city all around her, enormous and indifferent, and somehow in this specific moment on her side. She was 2 blocks from Deirdre's building when another notification hit her phone. Not from her bank this time. An email. From an address she didn't recognize with no subject line. She stopped, opened it. 3 sentences. "You asked the right question today. The Vantage deal is not the only thread. Be careful how much you trust what you've been given access to, including this meeting." No signature, no identifying information. The email address was a string of random characters that would bounce if she tried to reply. Hannah read it 3 times. She looked up at the building in front of her, Deirdre's building. Warm light in the windows above. Harold almost certainly positioned at the door with the expectant energy of a dog who could hear footsteps he recognized. She looked back at the email. Someone else knew about the Monroe meeting. Someone who was not Richard, because Richard had called her direct and rattled the move of a man working with incomplete information. This was something different. Someone who knew the content of the meeting, not just the fact of it. Someone who thought she needed to be warned. Or someone who wanted her to think she needed to be warned, which was not the same thing at all. Hannah took a screenshot of the email. She saved it to her notes app. She closed the email, put her phone in her pocket, and walked into the building. Deirdre opened the door before she knocked. Harold launched himself at Hannah's knees with the wholehearted commitment of a small dog who had been waiting a very long time and felt it was important she understood this. "Soup's on the stove," Deirdre said, and then she looked at Hannah's face. "What happened?" Hannah bent down briefly to put her hand on Harold's head. The dog looked up at her with absolute trust, the way only animals and children can, the way that makes you feel both seen and responsible. She straightened. She pulled out her phone. She showed Deirdre the email. Deirdre read it. She was quiet for a moment, then she handed the phone back. "How many people knew about your meeting today?" she asked. "Monroe's assistant knew." "Monroe?" "Me." Hannah paused. "And Richard called me, which means someone told him, so at least one more person." This email and Richard's call, same source. "Different," Hannah said. Richard was rattled. This email is not rattled. Whoever sent this is calm and informed and wants me to question something I'm not sure I've earned the right to question yet. Deirdre walked back toward the kitchen. "Come eat," she said, "and tell me everything from the beginning." Hannah followed her. Because there was soup and there was warmth, and there was a ridiculous small dog weaving between her ankles with total conviction that the world was better for her presence in it. And because she was starting to understand that she had not simply walked into a job offer this morning, she had walked into something considerably larger, something with threads running in multiple directions, touching people and decisions that extended far beyond a divorce and a frozen bank account and a conference room on the 43rd floor. Someone had designed her erasure, But someone else, possibly more than one, someone else had been watching that design with their own plans entirely. And Hannah Whitmore, who had spent 22 years sitting in rooms and seeing everything and saying very little was done, being the person who saw things and stayed quiet about them. She sat at Deirdre's table. She picked up her spoon. The soup was hot and real and exactly what she needed. "All right," she said, "from the beginning." The anonymous email sat in Hannah's mind like a splinter she couldn't locate precisely enough to remove. She had shown it to Deirdre. She had eaten the soup. She had slept better than the previous nights, which told her something about herself she found both useful and slightly alarming. That she could sleep well inside uncertainty. That her nervous system had apparently decided to treat the most destabilizing period of her life as an interesting problem rather than a catastrophe. She had been at Monroe Logistics for 11 days when the splinter finally made itself felt. The formal offer had come through within 48 hours of her meeting with Caleb Monroe on paper, with numbers that made her sit very still for a full minute before she read the rest of the document. The apartment situation resolved itself through a combination of Monroe's HR department, which maintained a small portfolio of furnished short-term corporate residencies for incoming senior hires, and Deirdre, who had called in a favor with a building manager she had known for 30 years and secured Hannah a month-to-month arrangement in a clean, simple one-bedroom on the Upper West Side that cost less than anything in her previous life and felt paradoxically more genuinely hers than anywhere she had ever lived. She had moved in with one bag, Deirdre's gray sweater, and the silver pen. She had started at Monroe on a Monday. The team of 7 analysts she was now responsible for were sharp, young, slightly wary of her in the specific way that smart people are wary of someone new whose credentials they can't fully verify through conventional channels. She had handled it the way she handled most things, by doing the work so precisely and so thoroughly that the question of credentials became irrelevant within the first week. By day 6, 2 of the analysts were coming to her with questions they hadn't been sent to ask. By day 9, a third had started forwarding her his preliminary reports before submitting them to the broader review process. By day 11, she arrived at 8 in the morning to find all 7 of them already and working with the particular focused energy of a team that has recently remembered what it feels like to have direction. Caleb Monroe had passed her in the hallway that morning and said nothing. He had simply looked at her with that expression she was learning to read, not quite satisfaction, more like the confirmation of a calculation he'd already made, and kept walking. She was thinking about that look when she opened her email and found the second anonymous message. Same structure as the first, random character address, no subject line, this time 4 sentences. Hale Capital filed for a compliance review extension on Vantage Meridian yesterday. The request was denied. The board meeting is Thursday. You should know that one of your current team members has a prior relationship with someone inside Hale Capital. Hannah read it 3 times. Then she closed her office door. She had her own office now, small, undecorated except for the notebook on the desk and a single plant that had been on the windowsill when she arrived, and that she had been watering on the principle that things left in her care were going to survive. The plant appeared to agree with this arrangement. She sat down. She thought carefully. The first anonymous message had warned her to question what she'd been given access to. The second was giving her specific operational intelligence about Richard's compliance situation, about her own team. Either someone was genuinely trying to help her navigate a situation far more complex than she'd understood, or someone was feeding her selective information to position her in a particular direction. Both possibilities required the same response verification before action. She opened the compliance database she had access to through Monroe's systems. It took her 12 minutes to confirm that Hale Capital had indeed filed an extension request on the Vantage Meridian due diligence review. It took her 4 more minutes to find the denial notice, which was public record once you knew where to look. The anonymous emailer had told her the truth about that, which made the second piece of information about her team significantly harder to dismiss. She spent the rest of the morning working through the Vantage project files she'd been given, and in the afternoon she called a team meeting. All 7 analysts around the conference table. She looked at each of them as they settled the way she had learned to look at people over 22 years of being in rooms and watching dynamics she wasn't supposed to notice. Marcus Webb, 26, Princeton undergrad, 3 years with Monroe. Did not look at her directly when he sat down. She filed that, said nothing. The meeting ran for 90 minutes. It was a working session, not a presentation, and she ran it the way she ran everything, by asking questions rather than making statements, by creating the conditions under which other people's best thinking could surface. By the end, the room had a different quality to it than when it had started, more alive, more focused. When it broke up, she said, "Marcus, stay a minute." The others filed out. Marcus Webb sat across from her with the careful neutrality of a man who had prepared for something. "How long have you known Jonathan Reese?" she asked. His expression didn't collapse, but it shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "I'm sorry." "Jonathan Reese. He's been Richard Hale's head of strategic intelligence for 4 years. You and he were in the same cohort at the Princeton finance program." She paused. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that is a person making a decision. "We've stayed in touch," he said finally. "Loosely." "When was the last time you were in touch?" "Last week." "Before or after I joined this team?" He looked at her. "The day after." A beat. "He asked me what you were working on." Hannah absorbed that without expression. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific. I told him you'd been brought on for senior analysis, which is public information within Monroe anyway." He shifted in his chair. I want to be clear. I didn't share any project details. I know where the lines are." "I believe you," Hannah said. And she did partially. He had told her the truth when he could have constructed a lie that would have held longer. That mattered. "But I need you to understand something. This team is working on material that has direct bearing on a situation involving Hale Capital. If Jonathan Reese contacts you again, I need you to tell me immediately and tell me what he asked." She paused. "Not because I'm penalizing you for a prior relationship, because I need to know which direction information is traveling." Marcus nodded. The careful neutrality had shifted into something more honest. "Understood." He stood to leave, then stopped. "Ms. Whitmore, for what it's worth, I knew whose paper that Vantage framework was built on. In 2022, when it appeared in the Hale Capital presentation." He met her eyes. "A lot of people in this building knew. We just didn't have any way to say it publicly." He left. Hannah sat alone in the conference room for a moment, the silence settling around her like something she had earned. Then she picked up her phone and called Deirdre. "Someone inside my team has been in contact with Richard's office," she said when Deirdre answered. "How bad us manageable? But it means the anonymous emails are coming from somewhere close to this situation, someone who has visibility into both sides." She paused. "And it means Richard is not as passive as I've been assuming." "No," Deirdre said. "He never was. You know that." She did. She hung up and went back to her desk and opened the Vantage Meridian files again, this time with the specific attention of someone who understood that she was not simply analyzing an acquisition target. She was looking at the architecture of a collapse. Richard's collapse, and whether it was already in motion and how close to the center of it she was standing. The Vantage files told a story. It took her until 7 in the evening to read it fully, but once she had, the story was clear and damning. Hale Capital had moved into the Vantage acquisition with a capitalization model that assumed a stability window that had already closed exactly the vulnerabilities she had mapped in her 2021 paper. The investment sequencing was structured on projections that hadn't been stress tested against the market conditions that now actually existed. The compliance review extension request was not a procedural formality. It was a desperate move by a firm that had realized too late that its central acquisition was built on a foundation with a crack running through it from top to bottom. She thought about Richard sitting in that boardroom. She thought about him presenting her framework, her analysis, her intellectual work to a group of people who had trusted him with their capital without understanding the depth of what he was working from, without the person who had built the framework to guide its application. He had taken the tool. He hadn't taken the understanding, and now the tool was being applied wrong in conditions it wasn't designed for, and the crack was spreading. She did not feel satisfaction. She was honest with herself about that. What she felt was something closer to the specific grief of watching a preventable disaster unfold. Because people had trusted Hale Capital with real money, real retirements, real futures. She wrote a memo that evening. She wrote it to Monroe, addressed directly to him, and she walked it to his floor at 7:45. He was still in his office. She had noticed he rarely left before 8, and she knocked and went in. He looked up from his desk. "You look like someone who found something." "I found several things," she said. She put the memo on his desk. "The Vantage situation is worse than I think even the compliance reviewers understand. The capitalization model has a sequencing error that isn't visible in surface-level review because it's embedded in projection assumptions that were credible in 2021 and are not credible now." She sat down across from him. "If the Hale Capital board meets Thursday and doesn't already have someone who can articulate this problem clearly enough to course-correct, the deal goes forward and the loss won't be contained." Monroe looked at the memo. He did not open it yet. He looked at her. "How certain are you?" "I wrote the original framework," she said. "I'm very certain." He picked up the memo. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, the way the information landed in him, processed, organized. It was a rare thing to watch a person with a genuinely powerful mind receiving new information. There was something almost mechanical in the efficiency of it. He set it down. "You understand what you're suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm showing you an analysis. An analysis that, if shared in the right context, would accelerate the collapse of a firm run by your ex-husband." She held his gaze. "An analysis that, if shared in the right context, would protect investors from a deal built on a flawed framework. Who those investors are and whose firm is running the deal is secondary to that." She paused. "If you're asking me whether this is personal, it's not. If the flawed deal were being run by anyone else, I'd bring you the same memo." Monroe held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." "There's something else," she said. She told him about the anonymous emails, both of them. She showed him the screenshots. She told him about Marcus and Jonathan Reese and what Marcus had told her and what she'd asked of him going forward. Monroe listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back. "The emails," he said. "You have a theory about the source." "Not a confirmed one," she paused, "but the information is accurate and it's specific. Whoever it is has access to Hale Capital's internal timeline and to roster information about my team. That's a small overlap." She looked at him. "I'd like to know if there's anyone in your network who has that particular combination of access." Monroe was quiet for a moment. "There might be," he said. "Let me make some calls." She nodded, stood, started for the door. "Hannah." She turned. Monroe was looking at her with that expression again, the one that was not quite satisfaction. "The Thursday board meeting. There's a venue. Pre-board dinner the night before. Several of the Vantage investors will be there. And Richard." He paused deliberately. "I've been invited. I haven't yet decided whether to attend." Hannah understood immediately what was being said and not said. "You're asking if you should. I'm telling you that if I attend, I typically bring a senior strategic advisor." The room was very quiet. She thought about Richard's voice on the phone, that tight, controlled tone with the fear underneath it. She thought about 22 years of sitting in rooms and not speaking. She thought about the memo on Monroe's desk and the 14 pages in her notebook, and the moment in Bryant Park when she had decided to pay attention instead of falling apart. "Go to the dinner," she said. Monroe nodded once. "Wednesday evening, 7 o'clock. I'll have my assistant send details." She walked out. The hallway was empty. The building was mostly quiet at this hour, the specific quiet of a place where serious work had been done, and the people who did it had finally gone home. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. And while she waited, she thought about Wednesday. 2 days away. A room that would contain Richard. A room that would contain people who had trusted him with their money and who deserved to know that the deal he was selling them was built on someone else's blueprint, applied wrong in conditions that had already changed. She was not going to that dinner to confront him. She was going to do what she had always done in rooms full of powerful people. She was going to be very still. She was going to watch, and she was going to speak precisely when speaking would accomplish the most good. The elevator came. She stepped in. She thought about the anonymous emails. Whoever was sending them had access to Hale Capital's internals and to Monroe's team roster. That was a narrow pool. She ran through the possibilities on the ride down the names and faces and relationships she'd been cataloging for 11 days inside Monroe's world, and 22 years inside Richard's. One name kept surfacing. She pushed it down because she didn't have confirmation, but it kept coming back. She filed it, carefully. The lobby was empty. She walked through it and out into the night air, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the building. The city moved around her the way it always did, enormous and purposeful, and entirely indifferent. Her phone buzzed. Third anonymous email. Same address. 2 sentences this time. Richard knows about the memo. Someone inside Monroe shared it within the last hour. Hannah read it twice. She looked back up at the building. Lights still on 28th floor. Monroe's office. She thought about who else had been in that building after 7. The skeleton crew, the night security, the one analyst she had passed on her way to Monroe's floor who had been getting coffee from the kitchen, who had nodded at her with the distracted air of someone working late. Her mind moved fast and clean the way it did when she stopped trying to manage her thoughts and just let them run. Marcus Webb had told Jonathan Reese she had joined the team. Marcus worked late. Marcus had been getting coffee from the kitchen at approximately 7:30. She had hand-delivered the memo to Monroe at 7:45, which meant she had passed Marcus in the hallway approximately 15 minutes before she had put something in Monroe's hands that Marcus would have had no way of knowing the content of, unless Marcus had been in that hallway for a reason other than coffee. She called Monroe's direct line. He answered on the second ring. "The memo," she said. "Who touched it between when I left your office and now?" A pause, short but real. "Why?" "Because I just received information suggesting its contents have been communicated outside this building within the last hour." The pause this time was longer. When Monroe spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger, something more controlled than anger. "I'll check the security log from my floor." "Check who was in the hallway between 7:15 and 7:45, she said, "and check Marcus Webb's access log for the same window." She heard Monroe writing something. "Go home, Hannah," he said. "I'll have answers by morning." She put her phone in her pocket. She started walking. Whoever was feeding her information was also watching her from the inside. And whoever had just fed Richard the memo was either the same person running a more complicated game than she'd understood, or a second person entirely working against her from inside a structure she'd only been part of for 11 days. She had walked into a job. She had actually walked into a war. And the front lines she was discovering ran directly through the building she'd just left, through the people she was learning to trust, through the distance between what she could prove and what she could only so far see. She walked faster. The night air was cold, and the city was loud, and somewhere across it, Richard Hale had just learned something about her that she had put in writing. She was not afraid. She was something colder and more useful than afraid. She was angry and she was thinking, and those two things together in Hannah Whitmore were, as Richard was about to discover, considerably more dangerous than anything he had planned for. Monroe called at 6:58 the following morning. Hannah was already awake. She had been awake since 5, sitting at the small kitchen table in the Upper West Side apartment, with her notebook open and the silver pen in her hand, building a map. Not a physical map, a relational one. Names connected to names. Decisions connected to outcomes. The shape of something that had been operating in the background of her life for longer than she had understood. She answered before the second ring. "Marcus Webb resigned this morning," Monroe said. "He submitted the letter by email at 6:41, effective immediately." Hannah closed her notebook. "Did he say why?" "Personal reasons, which is what people say when they've done something they don't want to explain." Monroe's voice was controlled, but she could hear the tension underneath it. Not anger at her, she understood that clearly, but the specific frustration of a man who had built careful systems, discovering a breach in one of them. "The security log confirms he was on my floor at 7:32 last evening. He did not have scheduled access to that area. He used a colleague's access card, someone who had gone home and left it in a desk drawer. He photographed the memo. Almost certainly." A pause. "I want you to know that I'm sorry. This is a failure of my systems, not yours. You brought me information in good faith, and it was compromised within my own building." "I know," Hannah said. "I'm not placing that at your door." She paused. "But I need to know something. The anonymous emails. Have you made any progress on the source?" "I have a strong candidate," Monroe said. "I'd rather tell you in person. Can you come in early?" "I'll be there in 40 minutes. She was there in 32. Monroe's office at 7:45 in the morning had a different quality than it did in the afternoon. Quieter, more stripped of pretense, the particular atmosphere of a space before the day has had time to perform itself. Monroe was standing when she came in, coffee in hand, and he turned when she entered, and she could see in his face that what he was about to tell her was something he had been sitting with since the previous night. "The emails," he said. "The source is Elena Voss." Hannah went very still. Elena Voss. She turned the name over looking for the connection, and then it surfaced clean and cold. Elena Voss was Richard's head of risk assessment for 6 years. She left Hale Capital in March, Monroe said. 8 months ago. She came to me 3 months after that. She's been consulting independently for Monroe on a separate project unconnected to your team, which is why you haven't encountered her. He set down his coffee. She reached out to me in October specifically about the Vantage situation. She had internal documentation from her time at Hale Capital that she'd retained legally. She was careful about that which showed the progression of decisions that led to the current capitalization problem. He looked at Hannah directly. "She knew about you. She knew about the 2021 paper. She was the one who first suggested I look at your work." The information landed in Hannah's chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward. "She suggested you reach out to me. She identified you as the person best positioned to understand and articulate the Vantage problem. She also knew about the divorce before it happened. She'd been watching Richard's maneuvering for months from the outside. She thought—" Monroe paused, choosing the next words carefully. "She thought you deserved to know what you were walking into. The anonymous emails were her way of giving you information without compromising her position as an independent consultant. Why didn't she just contact me directly? Because she wasn't sure you'd trust her, someone appearing out of nowhere claiming to have inside information about your ex-husband's firm right after your divorce. She thought it would read as manipulation." A pause. She may have been right. Hannah walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. She needed to sit with this for a moment. Elena Voss. A woman she had never met who had spent months watching a situation carefully enough to identify her reach out to Monroe on her behalf and then feed her specific and accurate intelligence through channels that would let her verify rather than simply believe. She was protecting herself, Hannah said, not as an accusation, as an accurate reading. She has documentation from Hale Capital. If Richard finds out she retained it and has been using it to orchestrate— "She's been very careful about what she's orchestrated," Monroe said. "She pointed me toward you. She gave you information. She has not shared her documentation publicly." He paused. "Yet." That single word sat in the air between them. "She's waiting," Hannah said slowly. "She's waiting to see how the Vantage situation resolves. If it collapses on its own through the compliance process, she doesn't need to surface. If it doesn't, then she has a decision to make," Monroe said. "And so do we." Hannah looked at him. "What kind of decision?" "The pre-board dinner is tonight. You and I will be in the same room as Richard Hale, several of his major investors, and 3 members of the Vantage Meridian leadership team." He picked up his coffee again. "I have a presentation slot, 15 minutes toward the end of the evening. Strategic overview of current market conditions as they relate to mid-market logistics acquisition." He held her gaze. "I'd like you to deliver it." The room was quiet. Hannah understood exactly what he was saying. A presentation at a dinner Richard would be attending. Her analysis, her voice, her name attached to conclusions that would directly illuminate the flaws in the deal Richard was selling to the people in that room. Not an attack, not a confrontation. A professional assessment delivered in a professional context that would do what accurate information always does in a room full of intelligent people with real money at stake. It would make them ask questions Richard couldn't answer. "He'll know what I'm doing," she said. "Yes," Monroe said simply. "He will. And the investors will draw their own conclusions from the information you present." He set down his coffee for the second time. "I am not asking you to destroy Richard Hale. I'm asking you to do what you do, analyze clearly, and present accurately. What people do with accurate information is their own business." Hannah thought about the 14 pages in her notebook. She thought about the memo. She thought about Elena Voss, a woman she had never met who had spent 8 months building a structure of information and patience and careful positioning to create this specific moment. She thought about a conference room on the 43rd floor and a pen signing 47 pages and Richard not looking up. "Yes," she said, "I'll deliver it." She spent the rest of the morning and into the afternoon building the presentation with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every word mattered and that the most powerful thing she could put in front of that room was not drama, it was clarity. Pure, documented, irrefutable clarity. At 2 in the afternoon, she received a text from a number she didn't recognize, but she knew immediately from the content who it was. It said only, "He knows you're presenting tonight. He's called 3 of the investors already. Be ready for a different room than the one you're expecting." Elena Voss. Hannah texted back, "Thank you, I'll be ready." A pause. Then, "You've been ready for longer than you know." Hannah put the phone down and went back to the presentation. At 4 o'clock, Monroe's assistant appeared in her office doorway. "Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Monroe wanted me to let you know the dress code for this evening is formal, and he asked whether you needed anything arranged." Hannah looked up from her laptop. She thought about the camel coat, the gray cashmere sweater, the dark slacks that belonged to Deirdre. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." What followed was the kind of hour that Hannah would remember not for what it contained, but for what it felt like Monroe's assistant and a woman named Patricia from the firm's executive support team navigating 3 phone calls and one very efficient trip to a boutique 2 blocks away that owed Monroe a professional courtesy. A deep charcoal dress precisely fitted exactly the kind of thing that communicated authority without performing it. Simple, impeccable. The kind of clothing that said the person wearing it did not need the clothing to speak for her, but understood that appearance was a language and she was fluent in it. She looked at herself in the boutique mirror. She thought, "I have never in 22 years chosen anything for myself without considering how it would be received, without filtering it through someone else's opinion or preference or the anticipated reaction of a room I was trying to fit into." This dress was hers. She had picked it in 30 seconds. It was right. She wore it. The dinner was held in a private room of a hotel in Midtown that Richard had used for Hale Capital events for years. Hannah knew this building. She had attended events here as Richard's wife, standing at angles that complemented his conversations, moving when he moved, introducing herself in the way that wives of powerful men introduce themselves with the slight self-effacement that signals, "I am not competition." She walked in with Caleb Monroe at 7:12 and felt the room change. It was subtle. It was the specific change that happens when a room that has established its own social gravity suddenly acquires a new element it hadn't factored. People noticed Monroe because they always did, and then they noticed who was with him. And there was a moment, just a moment, spreading through the room in a quiet wave where calculations were revised. She saw Richard from across the room. He saw her at almost the same instant. The expression on his face was something she had never seen on him before in 22 years. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise he'd known she was coming. Elena had told her that. It was something more unsteady than either of those things. The face of a man who had designed a conclusion and is watching the story refuse to arrive there. Beside him, Lydia Crow. 38, effortlessly composed, wearing something elegant and red that was clearly chosen with the calculation of someone who understood rooms. Lydia noticed Hannah a half-second after Richard did, and the composure held, but the eyes shifted a quick, assessing movement that said she was more alert than she was letting appear. Monroe guided Hannah through the room with the unhurried confidence of a man entirely comfortable in every space he entered. He introduced her to 3 people in the first 10 minutes. Each introduction was precise, not my colleague or my associate, but Hannah Whitmore, our lead strategic analyst, with the specific emphasis of a man naming a thing correctly. She watched each face receive the name. She watched the moment of processing, and in 2 of the 3 faces she saw the flicker, the recognition. Not of her personally, of the name. of having heard it somewhere in some context attached to some piece of work. The third person, a man named Gerald Patchett, who managed a substantial fund that had a significant position in the Vantage deal, looked at her and said, "Whitmore, you're not related to the Whitmore Analytics Group, are you?" "No," she said, "though I'm familiar with their work. There was a paper years ago about logistics investment sequencing. Brilliant piece of analysis. Someone in our team referenced it recently, and I could never track down the original author." He looked at her with the direct curiosity of a man who had spent 40 years trusting his instincts about people. "You wouldn't know anything about that." It was not quite a question. Hannah looked at Gerald Patchett steadily. "I'd be happy to discuss it after the presentation this evening," she said. "I think the topic will be relevant." Patchett's eyes sharpened. "I'll look forward to that." Monroe had moved slightly away, managing another conversation, and Hannah turned to find Richard standing 3 feet from her. He had moved through the room quickly and quietly. She gave him credit for that. He had always been good at navigating social spaces, at appearing where he intended to be, without appearing to have maneuvered. "Hannah," his voice was low, designed not to carry, "I want to talk to you." She looked at him. He was wearing the navy suit, the one she had always liked, which was an absurd thing to notice, and she noticed it anyway and filed it and set it aside. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been sleeping badly. "We are talking," she said, "privately." "This seems fine." His jaw tightened. "What are you doing here?" "I'm attending a dinner," she said pleasantly, "with my employer." "Hannah." Something shifted in his voice. Something she recognized from the early years, a note of genuine appeal beneath the control, a moment where the performance thinned. "What happened between us, I know it wasn't—" He stopped, restarted. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm asking you to consider what's at stake here. The Vantage deal has real investors, real people. If you go up there tonight and say what I think you're going to say, then real people will have real information," she said quietly, "which seems like what real investors deserve." "The deal is recoverable," he said. "I have a correction strategy in place." "Richard." She said his name the way you say the name of something you understand completely and no longer fear. "The capitalization sequencing error isn't correctable within the timeline the deal requires. You know that. I know you know that, because I know exactly how that error happened. I watched you take a framework I built and apply it without fully understanding the conditions under which it was valid." She paused. "I'm not going to lie to a room full of people to protect a deal that will hurt them. I couldn't have done that before, and I certainly can't do it now." His face went through several things in rapid succession. She watched them all. "You could have come to me," he said. His voice had something raw in it now. "When you found the problem, you could have offered to help you fix something you built on my stolen work," she said, very quietly, very evenly. "Is that what you would have done?" He had no answer for that. "Excuse me," she said, and she walked away. She walked directly to the bar, ordered a club soda, and stood with her back to the room for exactly 60 seconds, letting her heartbeat return to something professional. The conversation had cost her something. Not much, but a little. 22 years of accumulated history does not process itself in 3 weeks, and she was not pretending otherwise even to herself. 60 seconds. Then she turned around and went back to work. The presentation slot came at 9:15. The room had moved to the seated portion of the evening tables arranged in a configuration that was social but attentive. The kind of setup that said, "This is a dinner, but also information will be shared, and you should pay attention." Monroe introduced her in 4 sentences. No embellishment, just the facts of her position and the topic. She stood. She had given presentations in rooms like this before, rooms that contained money and power and the specific atmosphere of people who were accustomed to evaluating everything and everyone in front of them. She had given presentations as Richard's wife with the implicit asterisk of that identity hovering over everything she said. She had given them as an anonymous contributor whose name was removed before the slide deck reached its final audience. She had never given one as herself. Her name was on the first slide, large clean text, Hannah Whitmore, Senior Strategic Analyst, Monroe Logistics Group. She had put it there deliberately. She had looked at it for a long time when she built the slide, and she had not changed it. She began. She did not rush. She did not perform confidence. She simply had it the earned kind, the kind that comes from understanding your material so thoroughly that the room can feel it. She walked through the market conditions clearly, then moved into the structural analysis of mid-market logistics acquisition, and she felt the room's quality change as she moved deeper, the shift from polite attention to actual engagement. Gerald Patchett leaned forward at the third slide. Two other men she didn't know personally but recognized as major Vantage investors exchanged a look at the fifth. She reached the section on capitalization sequencing. She did not name Hale Capital. She did not name Vantage Meridian. She presented the structural pattern, the exact error type, the conditions under which it appeared, the consequences when it was not caught in time with the precision of someone presenting a case study in an academic context. The room was very quiet. She presented the final slide, a framework for identifying and correcting this class of error, timeline requirements, decision points, the window within which correction was possible, and the point after which the momentum of the deal structure made correction unviable. She paused. The window I've described, she said, closes in deals with the structural characteristics I've outlined approximately 90 to 100 days after the primary capitalization commitment is locked. After that point, unwinding requires either full restructuring with investor agreement or significant loss absorption. She paused again with the deliberate timing of someone who has said exactly what needs to be said and is allowing it to land. I'm happy to take questions. The first question came from Gerald Patchett. The paper you referenced in your third slide, the 2021 Framework for Logistics Investment Sequencing. Can you tell us who authored that? The room was very quiet. Hannah looked at Gerald Patchett. I did, she said. Patchett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked across the room, to where Richard Hale was sitting with the absolute stillness of a man who has just heard a door close and lock behind him. Then Patchett looked back at Hannah and said, I'd like to schedule a detailed conversation with you this week. Of course, she said. 3 other hands went up. She answered every question with the same clarity she had brought to the presentation, precise and unhurried, no performance in any of it, just the work and the knowledge and the particular confidence of someone who has finally stopped letting other people speak over her. She finished at 9:53. Monroe was waiting at the side of the room. He said nothing when she reached him. He handed her a glass of water. She took it. They stood together for a moment and let the room do what rooms do. After something significant has happened, reorganize quietly and rapidly around the new information. She looked toward the table where Richard had been sitting. He was gone. Lydia Crow was still there, but she was alone and her face had lost the careful composure of the beginning of the evening. She was looking at her phone with the concentrated urgency of someone receiving information that requires immediate decisions. Monroe said quietly, Patchett has already called 2 other investors. I just received a message. How do you know? Because one of those investors is a friend who thought I'd want to know. He paused. They're asking questions about the timeline, the one you outlined. Hannah drank the water. The room was buzzing now with the specific energy of money that has just realized it needs to move carefully. Elena Voss is outside, Monroe said. She came. She didn't come in. She's been waiting in the lobby. I think she'd like to meet you. Hannah looked at him. You knew she was there. She texted me 20 minutes ago. He looked at her steadily. She said she wanted to hear how it went. She didn't feel she had the right to be in the room. Hannah thought about a woman she had never met who had spent 8 months building a structure designed to give Hannah the ground to stand on, who had identified her work when no one else would, who had watched the erasure and decided quietly and carefully to do something about it. I'll go, Hannah said. She walked through the dining room. Several people stopped her hands-extended cards, offered the particular social currency of a room that has decided someone is worth knowing. She received each one graciously and kept moving. She walked through the lobby doors. Elena Voss was 54, with the direct posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms that tried to make her smaller and had stopped letting them. She looked at Hannah when she came out, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than that. I didn't know if you'd come out, Elena said. You came all this way, Hannah said. It seemed rude not to. Elena smiled. It was a real one, the kind that takes years to earn. How did it go? Patchett asked me who authored the 2021 framework. Elena's expression changed. What did you say? The truth, Hannah said. Elena absorbed that. She nodded slowly. Richard is going to fight this. I know. He still has influence. Board relationships. People who owe him. I know that too. And you're not afraid. Hannah thought about the conference room, the frozen accounts, Bryant Park, and the pigeons and $37 in her coat pocket, Deirdre's spare room, and Harold sleeping on her feet, and a notebook with 14 pages of notes written in the dark. I was afraid, she said, for about 4 seconds in an elevator. She paused. Then I stopped. Elena looked at her for a long moment. I have documentation, she said, from my time at Hale Capital, decision records, communication logs, material that shows a pattern of misattribution, of work product being absorbed and presented under a different name over an extended period. She held Hannah's gaze. It's yours if you want it. It has your name on it in the original source records, your analysis, your frameworks, your conclusions. She paused. It was always yours. I just kept the receipts. The night air was cold and the city was loud, and somewhere in the room behind her, Gerald Patchett was making phone calls, and Lydia Crow was sending urgent messages, and Richard Hale was driving through Manhattan trying to get ahead of something that had already moved past him. Hannah stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel, where she had attended 100 events as someone's wife, and she looked at a woman she had never met who had spent 8 months making sure she got her name back. Yes, Hannah said. I want it. Elena nodded. She reached into her bag and produced an envelope. Hard copies. The digital files will be on a drive that will arrive at your office tomorrow morning by courier. She held out the envelope. Hannah took it. It was not heavy, but it felt like the most substantial thing she had held in years. Thank you, she said. And then, because it was true, and Elena deserved to hear it said plainly, what you did, the emails approaching Monroe, all of it, you took a real risk for someone you didn't know. I knew your work, Elena said simply. That was enough, she paused, and I was tired of watching capable women get erased by men who needed to be the only person in the room. Her voice was even, but there was something old and real underneath it, the kind of thing that comes from personal history. We don't get to fix everything, but sometimes we get to fix one thing. Hannah held the envelope against her chest. Behind her, through the lobby glass, she could see Monroe moving through the room with his particular unhurried authority. She could see the investors clustered in new configurations, the social geometry of the evening rearranged around new information. She could see in the corner Lydia Crow still on her phone, and she understood that whatever Lydia was trying to manage, it had already grown past the point where one phone call could contain it. She could not see Richard. He had left the building. But she understood, standing on that sidewalk with an envelope of her own name in her hands, that leaving the building was not the same as escaping the situation. The situation was already in motion, and the person driving it now was not the person he had accounted for. It never had been. The courier arrived at Monroe Logistics at 9:17 the following morning. Hannah was already at her desk. She had been there since 7:45, which had become her rhythm, without her deciding it, the body finding its own schedule when the mind finally has somewhere worth going. The drive Elena had promised was in a small padded envelope with no return address, and Hannah signed for it with the same steady hand she had used to sign 47 pages of her own erasure 3 weeks earlier. She held the drive for a moment. Then she plugged it in. The files were organized with the precision of someone who had been preparing them for a long time, dated, labeled, cross-referenced. Elena Voss had spent 6 years inside Hale Capital watching things move through rooms that were supposed to contain them, and she had kept records the way a person keeps records when they understand that memory is not enough and that the truth, if it is going to survive, needs to be written down. Hannah opened the first folder. Her name appeared in the original source document dated March 2021, not as a contributor, as the author, the primary analyst. The framework attributed in full in internal communication to Hannah Whitmore, with a notation in Richard's own handwriting in the scanned margin that read, "Clean this up. Remove attribution before board version. She sat with that for a long moment. Remove attribution. Not an oversight, not a mistake made in the pressure of a deadline. A deliberate instruction, written in his hand, dated 4 months before the board presentation where he had stood in front of investors and presented her thinking as his own strategic insight. She opened a second folder, and a third. The pattern repeated across 4 years and 11 separate instances. Her analysis, her frameworks, her conclusions. Moving through internal channels with her name attached, and emerging into public-facing documents with her name removed and Richard's authority substituted. She had known this. She had understood it in the way you understand things you live inside, felt its shape, its weight, its daily texture. But understanding something as a lived experience and seeing it documented in black and white with dates and handwritten margin notes are two entirely different things. And Hannah sat at her desk on the 28th floor of Monroe Logistics and allowed herself for exactly 2 minutes to feel the full weight of what she was looking at. Not anger, something deeper than anger. The feeling of a person who has been told implicitly and explicitly for years that the thing they believed about themselves was not quite real, and then opens a folder and discovers that it was real, it was always real, it was documented and provable, and someone had been careful enough to keep the receipts. 2 minutes. Then she closed the folder, opened her email, and forwarded the drive contents to Deirdre's personal address with a single line, "In case I need someone else to have this." Then she called Elena. "I've looked at the files," she said when Elena answered, "and the margin note, March 2021, remove attribution before board version." She paused. "Did you know about that specific document when you reached out to Monroe?" "That's the document that made me reach out," Elena said. "I found it when I was doing my own exit documentation in March. I'd seen the pattern for years, but I hadn't had the specific instruction in writing." A pause. "I couldn't take it to anyone internally. Richard had too much insulation, and going public without someone positioned to receive the information, someone credible, someone whose own interests aligned with accuracy, would have just looked like a disgruntled former employee." Her voice was even. "I needed you to be in a position where your credibility was established first, where the room would hear you. That's why the timing mattered." "You waited 8 months, Hannah said. "I waited until the conditions were right," Elena said. "I'm sorry it required you to go through what you went through. I want to be honest about that. The divorce, the frozen accounts, the apartment, I knew it was coming. Richard had been positioning for it for 6 months at least. And She stopped. "I didn't have a way to warn you that wouldn't have triggered him to move faster and given you less time." The phone was quiet between them. Hannah thought about sitting on the bench in Bryant Park. The $37, the pigeons, the 4 seconds in the elevator. She thought about whether she would change any of it if she could. The answer was complicated in a way she hadn't expected. "I wouldn't have listened," she said finally. "If you'd warned me before, I was still inside it. I couldn't see it from the outside yet." She paused. "I think I needed to walk out of that building with nothing before I could understand what I actually had." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to use the documentation?" "Not aggressively," Hannah said, "but yes, through the appropriate channels." She paused. "I've already had a conversation with Gerald Patchett's legal team this morning. They're opening an independent review of the Vantage capitalization model. The documentation, Elena, the documentation you've given me, will be part of that review's source material." A beat. "It will be handled correctly. No spectacle, just accuracy." "That's all I wanted," Elena said. "I know," Hannah said. "I'll be in touch." She hung up and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. No drama in the execution, just the work. At 11 o'clock, Monroe called her into his office. He was standing at his desk. She had noticed he stood more than he sat, the posture of a man whose thoughts moved better when his body was upright, and he turned when she came in with an expression that was not quite serious and not quite something else. "Patchett's people called this morning," he said. 3 other investors have also been in contact with their attorneys. The Vantage compliance review has been formally reopened. He looked at her. "That's moving faster than I expected." "The presentation was clear," she said. "It was." He paused. I've also had 2 calls this morning from board members of other firms who were at last night's dinner. Both expressed interest in consulting arrangements. He looked at her steadily. I want to formalize your role, Senior Vice President of Strategic Analysis, with expanded authority over the team and a seat on the Acquisition Review Committee. He named a compensation figure that was, she registered with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 3 weeks with $1,400, a significant number. She looked at him. Why are you moving this fast? Because I've been in this business for 30 years, and I know what I'm looking at when I see it, he said simply. And because in my experience, when you find something real, you don't wait for someone else to notice. She thought about the right response to this. She thought about 22 years of things offered to her that she had made smaller before accepting, had apologized for wanting, had qualified with self-deprecation, designed to make other people comfortable with her competence. Yes, she said, I'll take it. Monroe nodded. No celebration, no performance, the direct acknowledgement of a man who had asked a question and received the answer he expected. There's one more thing, he said. The press, last night, generated attention. 2 financial journalists have already reached out to my communications team. The Vantage story is going to break publicly in some form within the next week, and your name is going to be in it. He paused. How do you want to handle that? Hannah thought about Richard driving through Manhattan the previous night, trying to get ahead of something that had already moved past him. She thought about Lydia Crow on her phone in the corner of the dining room, and the investors reconfiguring around new information, and the margin note in Richard's handwriting that said remove attribution, and had been written 6 months before he served her divorce papers. Accurately, she said. I want it handled accurately. No spin, no narrative, just the facts of what happened and who did what work. She paused. I've spent too long in rooms where accuracy was considered optional. Monroe looked at her with something that was she finally allowed herself to name it respect. The specific kind that comes from one person recognizing another's quality and not needing to diminish it to feel comfortable in its presence. Accurately, he said. Agreed. She left his office and walked back to her own and sat down and opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top SVP Strategic Analysis. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Deirdre. I have news, she said when Deirdre answered. Harold and I are ready, Deirdre said, and Hannah could hear the dog somewhere in the background making the particular sounds of a small creature who had opinions about things. Hannah told her. The role, the title, the Vantage review, the documentation. All of it clearly and without embellishment, the way she had learned to tell Deirdre things as information, not as performance to a person who received information with the directness it deserved. When she finished, Deirdre was quiet for a moment. Do you know what I'm thinking about? Deirdre said. Tell me. I'm thinking about a woman who sat down on a bench in Bryant Park 3 weeks ago with $37 and a camel coat and the particular expression of someone who has just been hit very hard and is deciding very quietly whether to get up. A pause. She got up. Hannah looked at the window. The city beyond it, ordinary and enormous, and completely unchanged by the things that had changed inside her. She did, she said. Come for dinner Sunday, Deirdre said. Harold has been impossible since you stopped sleeping here. I think he considers you a permanent resident, and the situation requires management. Sunday, Hannah said. I'll be there. She hung up. She worked through the afternoon with the focused pleasure of someone who has found the work they were meant to be doing and is finally being paid to do it. The team, 6 of them, now with Marcus gone, moved around her with the new efficiency of people who understood their direction. There were questions and conversations and 2 debates about methodology that Hannah enjoyed with the specific energy of someone who has spent years wanting to have exactly these debates and was finally having them. At 4:30, her phone rang. Richard. She looked at his name on the screen. She thought about not answering. Then she thought about the margin note and about 22 years of conversations she had managed around the edges of what she actually thought, and she answered. Richard. The compliance review. His voice was tight. Controlled, but tight the way a wire is tight when there's too much tension on it. You gave them documentation. The documentation was provided through appropriate legal channels, she said, by someone with standing to provide it. Elena Voss. I'm not going to discuss the source. She worked for me for 6 years. And she retained legal copies of documents she was entitled to retain, Hannah said. I'd suggest you talk to your attorney about that rather than to me. A pause. She could hear him breathing. She had spent 22 years learning the map of his voice, the same way she'd learned the map of his face, and what she heard in his breathing now was not anger, but something more unsettled, fear maybe, or the particular feeling of a man who has built a structure around himself and can hear it starting to shift. Hannah. His voice changed, dropped to something more personal, the tone he used when the room was empty and the performance was down. The voice she had trusted for so long. What we had, it wasn't nothing. I know what I did was wrong. He stopped. Is there any version of this where we talk like people who once knew each other? She thought about what it would cost her to say no, simply out of bitterness. And she thought about what it would cost her to say yes out of the old habit of managing his discomfort. Neither she decided. There's a version, she said, where you acknowledge in writing the authorship of the frameworks that appeared under your name in Hale Capital Materials between 2021 and 2024, where that acknowledgement becomes part of the formal record, where the correction is made clearly and publicly. She paused. If you do that, if you do it because it's accurate and not because you're calculating the legal minimum, then yes. I think there's a version where two people who once knew each other have a conversation. Silence on the line. And if I don't, he asked, then the documentation goes through the review process and the record corrects itself without your participation, she said. Either way, the record corrects itself, Richard. The only question is whether you're part of how that happens. Another silence. Longer. I'll have my attorney call yours, he said. I'll let Monroe's legal team know to expect it, she said. She hung up. She sat at her desk with the phone in her hand and let the conversation settle through her. It had not felt the way she would have expected, not triumphant, not vindicated, not even particularly emotional. It had felt like accuracy, like a conversation that had been waiting to happen for years, finally happening in the only form it could have taken if both people were going to be honest. She did not know if Richard would make the call. She did not know if he had the capacity to do the things she'd described, not the legal version, not the strategic calculation, but the actual honest acknowledgement. She had watched him for 22 years, and she was not confident. But she had meant what she said. Either way, the record was correcting itself. 3 days later, Lydia Crow became the subject of a separate inquiry. It surfaced through the Vantage Compliance Review in the way that things surface when you begin to properly audit a structure. You pull one thread and discover it connects to another, and that one to another, and eventually you're holding something considerably larger than the thread you started with. Lydia, it emerged, had been a direct participant in several of the investment decisions under review, not peripherally, centrally, with her own financial interests intertwined with the deal in ways that had not been disclosed to the other investors. Hannah learned this from Monroe, who told her in his usual direct fashion. Fact-context implication, no embellishment on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the dinner. She registered it with the same evenness she had tried to bring to everything. Not satisfaction, not vindication. The feeling of watching a structure reveal its own weight when the external support is removed. Lydia retained her own attorney this week, Monroe said, separately from Richard. I thought you should know. Separately, Hannah said. Yes. He looked at her. That particular partnership appears to be encountering some structural difficulties of its own. Hannah nodded. She thought briefly about Lydia in the red dress in the corner of the dining room on her phone, with the urgent focus of someone trying to manage a situation that had already grown past management. She felt something for her that was not uncomplicated. Lydia had made choices, real choices, but she had also been inside a structure built by someone very skilled at making structures that served his interests, and obscured that fact until the foundation cracked. She chose not to say any of that. She filed it in the part of herself that was still working things out. All right, she said. What's on the agenda for this morning? 6 weeks after the dinner, Richard Hale submitted a written acknowledgement to the Vantage Meridian Independent Review. It was legal language, careful, and minimal, the product of a man doing the legal calculation and arriving at the conclusion that acknowledgement was less costly than continued contest. It was not the honest version she had described on the phone. It was not full or generous or arrived at from a place of genuine reckoning, but it named her. In a formal legal document with a date attached, it named Hannah Whitmore as the originating analyst of the strategic frameworks that had appeared in Hale Capital's materials. She read it in her office on a Wednesday afternoon. She read it twice. Then she saved it to the drive alongside Elena's documentation. That evening, she called Elena. "He filed it," she said. "I know, I heard." Elena's voice had something quiet in it. "How do you feel?" Hannah thought about the question carefully. She looked at the plant on her windowsill, which had put out a new leaf in the past 2 weeks and appeared to be committed to the project of surviving under her care. "I feel like it's accurate," she said. "I feel like accuracy is what I wanted, and accuracy is what I have." A pause. "I don't feel the way I expected to feel." "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Something louder, maybe." She paused. "This feels like the quietest version of it, which is somehow the most right." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I heard Monroe has you presenting at the Northeast Investment Conference in February." "He asked me last week." "Are you going to do it?" "Yes," Hannah said. And then, because it was true in a way, she wanted to say out loud, "I'm looking forward to it." Elena made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was warm and real. "Good. You should be." 2 months after that conference presentation in which Hannah Whitmore's name appeared in the program as keynote presenter, and in which 3 separate journalists noted her as the session's most substantive voice, Monroe called her into his office for a different kind of conversation. He sat this time. She sat across from him. The city was behind him through the window, and the morning light was doing what morning light does, making ordinary things look for a moment like they might be significant. "I want to talk about the future," he said. "All right." The firm's next phase of growth involves international positioning, specifically a hub presence in one of 3 cities. I won't name them yet, because the decision isn't final, but the person who leads that expansion would need to relocate. He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if that's something you'd want to consider." Hannah looked at him. "You're asking if I'd leave New York." "I'm asking if you'd want to lead something of your own," he said, "in a place that isn't weighted down by the last 22 years of your life." She sat with that. She thought about the Upper West Side apartment that had started as a temporary arrangement and had become in 4 months genuinely hers in a way no space had felt in years. She thought about Deirdre's kitchen table and Harold's absolute conviction that Hannah's continued presence in his world was non-negotiable. She thought about the view from her office window on the 28th floor Manhattan, doing what Manhattan always does, moving without particular interest in anyone's interior life. She thought about what it would mean to walk into a city where she was not Richard Hale's ex-wife, not the woman from the conference room, not the name attached to a story that people in this city's financial circles had been discussing for 3 months. To be simply Hannah Whitmore in a place that had no pre-existing definition of what that meant. "Which cities?" she said. "Chicago, Boston, one overseas that I want to confirm the infrastructure for before naming." "The overseas one," she said. Monroe looked at her. "I haven't confirmed it yet." "I know, but when you do, that's the one I want to hear about." Something in his face shifted. Not surprise, more like the confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "You're sure?" "I'm not afraid of new," she said. "I've been afraid of new my whole life, and I've discovered recently that the fear was unfounded." She paused. "Let me know when it's confirmed." He nodded. She stood and walked to the door. Then she stopped because there was one thing she needed to say while they were being this direct. "Caleb." She had not used his first name before. He looked up. "What you did reaching out when you did, giving me a room to work in when all I had was $37 and a camel coat and a notebook full of patterns that weren't mine to act on alone." She paused. "I won't make a speech about it, but I want you to know I understand what it was." Monroe looked at her with the expression she had come to understand as his most honest one. Not the assessing look, not the confirmation look, but something quieter and more personal. "You did the work," he said. "I just made sure the room existed." "Yes," she said, "but rooms matter." She left his office and walked down the hallway and stood for a moment alone with the particular feeling of someone who has arrived somewhere they never expected to reach and is trying to take in the full fact of being there. Somewhere in this city, Richard Hale was managing the fallout of a deal that had been built on her stolen thinking. Somewhere, Lydia Crow was in the middle of a legal process that was no one's idea of a simple exit. The machinery of consequence was moving the way it always moves, slowly, impersonally, in the direction of accuracy. She did not feel triumphant about any of it. She felt the way she had felt on the bench in Bryant Park, clear, observant, present, but not diminished, not erased, not anyone's appendage, or anyone's blind spot, or anyone's unpublished footnote. On the following Sunday, she went to Deirdre's for dinner. Harold launched himself at her knees with the wholehearted conviction of a dog who considered this arrangement permanent and non-negotiable. Deirdre had made something complicated that smelled extraordinary, and they ate at the kitchen table with the easy quiet of people who have sat at this table enough times to not need to fill every silence. At the end of the evening, Hannah told her about the overseas opportunity. Not the specific city yet, Monroe hadn't confirmed it, just the shape of it, the possibility. Deirdre listened. She refilled her coffee. She sat back. "You're going to go," she said. "Not a question." "I think so," Hannah said. "Good." Deirdre looked at her across the table with something direct and clear and full of the particular warmth of a person who has decided someone is worth caring about and has no intention of rescinding that decision. "You were always going somewhere. You just needed someone to move out of the doorway first." Hannah looked at Harold, who had positioned himself on her feet with absolute commitment, his warm weight like an anchor she was going to genuinely miss. She looked at Deirdre's kitchen, the books and the cedar smell and the coffee and the light. She thought about all the temporary places she had lived as a permanent place, and this temporary place she had lived as a home. She was not destroyed. She had never been destroyed. She had been rerouted sharply, violently, without her consent, and the route had taken her through $37 and Bryant Park and a spare room and an anonymous email and a dinner where she had stood in front of a room full of money and power and told the truth with her name on the first slide. And here she was, not surviving, not recovering, not even rebuilding, which implies going back to what was. Building, present tense, active. Hers. The silence that Richard had mistaken for her weakness had simply been her listening, and what she had heard in all those years of careful listening was everything she needed to know to move without him. She had signed those papers in silence. She had stood outside in the cold in silence. She had sat on that bench in silence and watched the pigeons and thought and not broken. And the silence had not been emptiness. It had never been emptiness. It had been the sound of a woman deciding exactly what she was going to do next.